Movement 2 of the spiritual exercises takes us, of course, into the life of Christ, the story of Christ. And for Ignatius, it's very much a story that he leads us through. But the peculiar thing that we might notice as we look at the text of the exercises is that movement 2 doesn't begin with the birth or with the incarnation or anywhere in the Gospels, in fact. Ignatius begins instead almost as though outside of time with the call of the king meditation. So I want to talk about why he might do this, why we would choose to give this retreat in this way where perhaps Kevin O'Brien and others don't, and what's going on here so we can be prepared to introduce this exercise, at least with a few brief words, when your retreatant begins movement 2. Now, if you were to open the text of the exercises and turn to what Ignatius calls the second week, what we're calling the second movement, the first thing you'll see is the heading, The Call of the Temporal King. He offers no other introduction to the week. We simply begin here, imagining how Christ calls his followers to join him in his kingdom work. And if we were to keep turning the pages after this exercise, we'll see that Ignatius takes us immediately into the incarnation and the nativity, Jesus' childhood, and on chronologically into the life of Jesus. So if Ignatius is inviting us into this story, if the action of the spiritual exercises is to sweep us into a dramatic narrative playing out before us, why does Ignatius give us this scene apparently out of order? Why don't we begin with the incarnation, breaking into the desperate longings of movement 1? The answer, I think, is given in the simple line that introduces the call of the king meditation. Ignatius writes, quote, "It is a help to contemplate the life of the eternal king." In other words, before we even begin to contemplate the life of Christ in the gospel scenes, let's help ourselves in this endeavor, because if we're going to understand this life, who this Christ truly is, we need to give ourselves a particular picture through which to view him. And for Ignatius, it's to understand the whole of Christ's life as a king calling his people to share in his work, his project. Put another way, the call of Christ, "Come follow me," isn't something that occurs just in the course of his life as an event, in a sequence of events, such as we'll later meditate on. Rather, this call that we open ourselves to here is what Christ's life is. Christ's life presents itself as this call. So in one sense, the call of the king is the first meditation in this movement, and in another sense, it's more than that. It's the heading and the interpretive key of Christ's life as we're going to enter into it and meditate on and be subtly conformed to. It's the lens through which we're offered to see Christ's life such that we might not just hear the calling of the disciples or hear Christ's call to us through the disciples, but through every scene that we meditate on and contemplate on: his birth into poverty, his flight into Egypt, his ministry, and the passion and the resurrection. All of this, the same calling of the king, calling out to us to share in his work. It's a call that echoes and endures and appeals to us endlessly in each moment. In the dramatic arc of the exercises, we set up our retreatants to be grounded in the love of God so they can stand to have God reveal in them some of the deeper disorder and attachment so that Christ can then come into the thick of their disorder with mercy and love, but also with desire and direction. And if we begin the call of the king, it's in order that we might see how Christ doesn't merely want to forgive and heal once for all with a magic wand that he waves over us, but how he wants to invite us to choose to participate in something grand and redemptive that ceaselessly invites us. This is what the spiritual exercises wants to offer. So to help us, we're invited to imagine a king. Now, we can actually think of this meditation as taking shape around basically 3 points. Ignatius technically gives us 6 points, but we can simplify it a little bit more. First, we imagine and we notice how a good and charismatic leader would capture the hearts of people with promise and possibility, and how people would just naturally respond to somebody with a clear and compelling vision It's just a matter of common sense. Second, then we imagine Christ in the place of this worldly leader, with an even grander and nobler vision for redeeming and healing the whole world. And we notice how much more we'd respond as a matter of common sense to an eternal leader who can promise us victory. And so third, Ignatius ventures to take us one step further and invites us to notice how someone might respond still more deeply, not just out of common sense, as with the worldly leader, or because Jesus' kingdom vision appeals to reason, but out of devotion, moved by Jesus himself to the point of not only wanting to consent to follow, but wanting to abandon everything else so they can join in this service. And Ignatius' meditation just asks us to consider each of these. And in this, what we're doing is really desiring for it to do, to bring us into, bring this compelling force to bear on our desires, to capture the desires that are already there, longing for Christ to invite us into what we're built for, what we're made for. It's not a matter of guilt or obligation of how I'm supposed to respond. What it's wanting to elicit is the heartfelt response that we're made for, that's just natural for our hearts. So when Ignatius says in the first part of the meditation to, quote, consider what the good subjects ought to answer a king so liberal and so kind, and hence if anyone does not accept the appeal of such a king, how deserving he would be of being censored by all the world. He's getting at the reasonableness of our response. He wants us to imagine a leader so compelling that you'd have to look at anyone who wasn't moved by their vision and think they must just not have been listening. Ignatius is trying to get us to pay attention to what just a reasonable response would be. And he simply suggests that it would be to blurt out, yes, let's end hunger and poverty and loneliness and restore all people to one another. Why wouldn't we? That's what we're trying to set up. And the challenge for us as directors can be for us to just introduce this meditation, not generically, not rotely, but with the responsibility of adapting the retreat however will be most helpful for our retreatant. And this, what we need to realize is important, isn't the original language or the original presentation of Ignatius, it's the effects we've just described. So how might we create the conditions in which a person will experience the reasonableness of an extraordinary response to an extraordinary vision of an extraordinary leader? That's the task for us. So Ignatius' original language of kings campaigning and conquering won't appeal to everybody. For some, it's wonderfully evocative for their imagination, and it draws familiar imagery from medieval myths and fantasy worlds like Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. For some, it smacks of militarism and triumphalism in ways that can actually pose an obstacle to any way into this. And in this case, we might instead invite them to imagine a community organizer or a leader of a grassroots campaign, although this might still run the risk of provoking a kind of cynical reception. So certainly use what you know of your retreatant, and if you notice something in particular is emerging as meaningful for them, say if ecological injustice deeply bothered them in Movement 1, you might work that into the call of the charismatic leader to help elevate that appeal for them in order to help elevate Christ's better appeal and what the reasonable response to it is. And of course, this isn't always evident or easy. What I tend to lean on then is just trying to introduce the spirit of the meditation as well and as concisely as I can, and ask for the reader's grace with the language and imagery, giving them explicit permission to abandon what's not inspiring them and to notice what is. Ignatius gives us permission to ask for this grace in the presupposition at the start of the exercise, is number 22 in the text, to ask that we would each be more willing to give a gracious interpretation to what's said or shared, to try to even find what's redemptive in it. So just in this way, we can also ask them to have grace for Ignatius in his context if needed, especially if we can point them to the spirit of the thing, what Ignatius is actually desiring for them, what the exercise is truly desiring to give as a grace. So one last caveat, as we emphasize the importance of offering the call of the King as a filter through which we would hear the call of Christ throughout his whole life, making an appeal to us, it's important that we hear who this King is that calls us. And I've accompanied people I didn't believe we're able yet to separate Christ from the God image that too much resembles an aloof, dictatorial, capricious human king. And in that case, I adapted their retreats to begin the second movement with the incarnation and nativity, to allow the weakness and the smallness of Christ to act as that lens for seeing this meditation, to see the life that Christ calls us from and into. And this is one of the innumerable options that we have for our discernment. But to summarize, what the Call of the King meditation wants is for them simply to notice how they would respond to what already moves them, what already captures their heart, the naturalness of Christ's extraordinary invitation and their own authentic response. We facilitate this by first setting them up to be genuinely appealed to by some imagined leader as a matter of common sense, in order that they might notice how much more Christ appeals to their desires and their desires to respond to him. Because it's out of this response here that they'll enter into movement two, to hear Christ call them again and again and again through the whole of his life, through all of his life, in all of their life.